Good morning. It is 10:43 a.m. on Sunday, August 11th, 2019. I'm Christiana Ellison. I've actually been up for a little bit, poking around and procrastinating. This is 5 more minutes. It is Sunday, and that means I'm continuing my rewatch of Gravity Falls. This episode is Season 2, Episode 16, Roadside Attraction. And this is a fairly light filler episode that has some interesting ideas in it in terms of communicating kind of a lesson for Dipper, but I think it ends up a little bit too nuanced for its own good, leading to the message being a little bit muddled. But I'm going to talk more about that in a little bit. But I will say it was nice, granted the time by having a story that wasn't necessarily packed to the gills with important stuff. They were able to return to the full-length opening credits instead of the shortened version, and I kind of missed that. I like the opening credits for this show. But the main plot of this episode is pretty straightforward. The gang's going on a road trip to help Grunkle Stan prank the owners of a variety of roadside attractions that are competitors with the Mystery Shack. According to him, this is retribution for pranks they played on him, but of course by the end we certainly see that this is a perhaps never-ending cycle of pranks and returned pranks and so on. But, that's just kind of the setup for the episode, because the real plot is Dipper still having some lingering feelings over Wendy and taking some bad advice from Stan about how to talk to girls. And it doesn't go well, and we have Stan's own sort of parallel thing not going well, and that's all kind of paired with doing the pranks, which doesn't really have much thematic connection to anything else. There's not much else going on for most of the other kids, except Candy gets a little bit more of a chance to shine than usual. It's not a very weighty episode, but let's talk about that advice, right? This advice from Stan and that Dipper takes. It's basically, the issue is that we have Dipper still having some lingering feelings because he can understand and certainly forgive Wendy for not being into him, but he doesn't know what to do with his own feelings there. And that's certainly an understandable reaction, and I think it's actually pretty mature one on his part. We talked about that, when we last dealt with the Dipper Wendy thing, how it's possible for him to understand and not be mad at Wendy for not being into him, because I think that's something that you see somewhat, and I'll talk more about that in a minute here too. But in any event, he's feeling like, he's just not sure what to do. He's kind of stuck, pining over her pines, but still not, knowing that it can't happen. And so what Grunkle Stan tells him to do, honestly, is kind of the kid-friendly version of being a pickup artist, right? And I think that this is actually, by making it kid-friendly and softening the behavior to a certain point, it does produce an outcome that I think is possible for people to misinterpret. And that is perhaps not a bullseye in terms of whatever message they're trying to convey. But basically what Stan asks him to do is essentially be a little bit of a jerk, be kind of annoying in a funny way, being confident, being funny, and that sort of thing, and basically inviting him to just take the pressure off of himself. And all of these things are effective because in and of themselves, some of those are not bad advice. Like the being a jerk, I think, is not a great way to put it. But the point of being, don't fawn all over them like you're desperate, right? That's not bad advice, right? So some of allowing him to be confident and cool and funny, like he does have those qualities in him, and sort of freeing him up to be able to express that is good advice. But where it falls flat is Stan telling him to do that with basically every girl he sees, with no intention of actually following up with any of them. In fact, with the explicit intention of not following up with any of them, because he is just treating them as practice, talking to girls. This is, of course, where the actual badness of the advice comes in, because you're not treating these girls like actual human beings. You're treating them like practice dummies. And that's not cool, right? And it comes to back to bite him, because, of course, he is having success getting phone numbers and email addresses from lots of these girls that he's meeting at these various tourist attractions. But then, as part of his sort of new attitude and behavior, Mabel's friend Candy starts feeling like maybe she's interested in Dipper. And Mabel, ever the matchmaker, says, let's make this happen. And, I think Mabel, obviously, we've established, especially having a whole episode about it, she's kind of a meddler. She's kind of pushy about that sort of thing. But it's at least motivated from a place of wanting people to be happy, right? She loves love and likes the thought of her friend and her brother being in love. And that's not bad, but she is kind of pushy and meddling about it. But in any way, she orchestrates time for Candy and Dipper to be alone. Dipper is also operating from some bad advice here, which is to say, because this is just practice, you have to say yes to everything. And so even though he's not really feeling those feelings for Candy, he agrees anyway, even though he's worried that, like, well, am I leading her on? But he's told, you have to anyway. And so what we, and then, of course, when he's going on a date with her, coincidentally, several of the other girls that he was practicing on happened to show up and realize that, he's been saying the same sorts of things to everybody, making it sound like he was interested, but he's really not, because he's just saying the same things to everybody. And then, of course, they all get mad. They call him a jerk. And, that is kind of where that's left. And, we have Candy, whose feelings are hurt, going back and telling Mabel and Grenda, and they're mad now too. And Dipper's basically feeling like pretty crummy about it. And this is all paired with Stan doing his pickup artist thing with the owner of this particular Mystery Mountain attraction, who turns out to be someone who knows all of those pickup artist tricks and uses them to lead Stan on, because she's actually a spider lady who plans to drain him his fluids. There's some nice stuff going on in terms of the foreshadowing of there being something weird with this place. They've got real attractions, House of Mummies, new mummies daily, Dipper says. What does that mean? And it's like, turns out that it's spider people who drain them. Yeah. So that, so Dipper has to convince the girls, like, to help him rescue Stan. It's like, I know you're mad at me, but we have to help Stan. And so they do, and they get away, largely because Candy's actually pretty smart. And so Dipper does kind of develop, now that it's sort of too late, an appreciation that there was something more to Candy than he had really looked at, which is, again, emblematic of the idea that you need to not think of each girl as an individual human being. They are not just some homogeneous blob of girls, right? Anyway, So he does recognize now, too late, that there was maybe something that he could appreciate with Candy, but she's no longer interested because she lost interest when she saw him running away from the spider lady screaming. And then, of course, everyone goes back home. But I want to talk a little bit about some of the lessons there, because one of the things I noticed in reading, so with every episode, I watch it myself, and then I also review the entry on the episode from a Gravity Falls wiki. And one of the things, there was a note on this episode towards the end, is, let's see, this is actually in the trivia section for this episode. One of the points was, many fans consider this as the worst out of every Gravity Falls episode due to its awkward nature and treatment of Dipper. Now, I don't know how many fans actually is there, but I read through the message board a little bit, trying to get more of a sense of what exactly was going on there. There were a whole lot of people whom I'm assuming are probably guys who are basically making the case that Dipper did nothing wrong, and that it was actually the girls that were awful and mean for making him choose when he really didn't, he didn't make any promises to any of them, and that, he was just trying to get over Wendy. He didn't do anything wrong. And it's the problem is that this is where the nuance of, I think, what the episode was trying to show comes in, is that they didn't want to show Dipper being too awful, because he's the hero of their kids' show. But by soft pedaling some of the details there, I think they perhaps left the impression that, Dipper's behavior was perhaps more acceptable than it was. And the thing is, was Dipper an awful human being, deserving of contempt? No. He's a kid who's lost in this, took some bad advice. But the point is, the idea of he wants to learn how to talk to girls. Sure, fine. He wants to get over Wendy. Those are not bad things. But what's a bad thing is when this human being that he's made a connection with, he gets up the confidence, he's able to talk to her, she likes him enough that she gives him her email because she's a human being who would like to keep talking with him. And if he has no intention of actually ever writing her emails, and he doesn't actually care about writing her back or actually being friends with her, yes, that's being a jerk. He is using another human being for his benefit. Now, just because he didn't, act like, he obviously didn't assault anyone. We're not talking about harassment or anything. But yes, he took individual human beings and used them to hone his dating skills with no intention or care about, let's not say he didn't care, because he expressed concern to Stan about, am I leading these girls on? The answer is yes. But he's concerned about that. And so what we reveal ultimately, though, in what I think is the episode's intended lesson, is that Stan's advice for how to treat this sort of thing literally only works if all you ever intend to do is flirt or have one-night stands, essentially. That's all that it's good for, because you never develop the ability to make that second step, which is to continue a relationship with someone. And that's where it gets especially dangerous when, and emotionally dangerous, when Stan tells him he has to say yes to everything, because, of course, Candy is not just another girl he's never going to see again, right? She is one of his sister's best friends. And so hurting her feelings carries additional repercussions beyond just being a jerk to one girl somewhere that he'll never see again. And so I mean, I think that that's a reasonable lesson we can all say. You know, don't lead people on. Don't treat human beings as though they only exist to help you practice your conversational skills. That's the lesson ultimately. And yet, by not making it a little bit more clear, it's obvious that there are some fans of the show that watched this episode and thought he did nothing wrong. They were awful for making him choose when he didn't promise them anything. It's like, but that's not true. They gave him their email and their number because he was essentially saying, it's not like dating. He didn't ask them to get engaged, but he did essentially say, I am interested in you. Let's continue to communicate, but didn't actually intend to. So every single one of those girls, if his plan had gone according to plan, would be assuming, waiting for him to email or call, and he never would. And then how are they supposed to feel, right? So I feel like people who are kind of can have a healthy view on these things understand that. But it's very clear looking at the message board that there are a lot of people who are fans of this show who hate this episode. They think Mabel was an awful person for forcing Dipper to go on a date with Candy. And that the other girls at the attraction were nasty jerks for forcing Dipper to choose between them and ruining everything when he had done nothing wrong. And I'm just like, oh. So I guess the lesson that I would hope people can take away from this is that even if this girl is someone that you've never met before and you never expect to see again, doesn't mean she's not an individual human being with her own thoughts and feelings. All right? So maybe treat people like that, and you'll start seeing where some of the logic in Stan's advice starts to fall flat. Anyway, yeah, it's kind of like it's how big a red flag it is when you see that someone is like mean to waiters or something like that. If they think that you only have to be nice to people that you expect to see again, that is a red flag. Anyway, though, there's some other stuff going on. I will say that some of these roadside attractions were pretty cool. The upside down house was especially interesting, even though obviously I think the Velcro shoes that's letting everybody walk upside down. Physics much? But it was very cool. And it made me wish that such a thing did exist because that would be neat. But other ones were, more standard things that you'd expect, biggest ball of yarn, corn mazes, that sort of thing. It's a weird sort of minor key note to have Seuss get lost in the corn maze and be left behind, and then to follow up with them realizing that they've had the whole second half of their trip without him, and him just standing in the middle of the corn maze because the advice he got is if you ever get lost, stay where you are. It's kind of a sad note there, but poor Seuss there. And there's some good imagery, like the fact that ultimately the Spider Lady Darlene is stopped because she's crushed under the boot of a giant Paul Bunyan statue, and she talks about oh no, a giant boot, my only weakness. A giant rolled up newspaper or paper cup would have also been effective. It's interesting, though, I think that they don't deal with her in a final way. She's not killed by the boot, just sort of pinned to the ground so she can't get at them. And they don't, the family does not deal with her in any sort of way. They know that she effectively promises that, I will always have prey as long as there are men like you, Stan. And so everyone just leaves, presuming that she's going to keep doing what she's doing, which is a little bit of a morally gray note, I think. They don't call the police or anything? I don't know. Anyway, So this is a weird episode. It's, you know, you could call it a filler episode just because it doesn't really advance the main plot at all. But at the same time, I would call it less of a filler episode and more of just a pacing episode, because you need a breather sometimes to try to space out the big revelations, especially since I think we have just one more episode before we get into the big 3-part finale. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it there for now, and I will talk to you all tomorrow for 5 more minutes.